On Christmas Eve, my only son locked me outside in the snow. Hours later, when they finally opened the door, someone else was sitting in my place at the table. That moment changed everything. I can still hear the sound of the lock clicking behind me. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. The laughter I once knew as comfort echoed from inside the warm house. While I stood in the freezing dark, my hands trembled, not just from the cold, but from the shock of realizing my own child had turned the key against me. For years, I had built my life around him, Christmas mornings with hot cocoa and cinnamon rolls, hand-stitched stockings hung by the fireplace, the smell of pine filling our living room. Every holiday, I poured every ounce of love into making him feel cherished, safe, and celebrated. And yet, on the night when family should mean the most, I was treated like an intruder. The snow bit into my skin, flakes catching in my hair as I pounded on the door. My voice cracked as I called his name. No answer. Just muffled conversation and the faint clinking of silverware, like I was nothing more than an unwelcome stranger outside someone else's home. You don't prepare for betrayal like that. You don't imagine that the child you carried, the boy whose scraped knees you bandaged, the man you cheered for at graduations, would one day turn his back on you when the world was frozen and dark. If you're watching this video, give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I want to know how far this story reached. Because honestly, telling this isn't easy. It hurts to relive betrayal, but your support keeps me going. And what happened next? Well, it's not the kind of thing you read in holiday cards. It's not the kind of story families tell around the fire. But it is the truth. And it will make you question what family truly means. When I think back on my life as a mother, I don't measure it in years, or birthdays, or holidays. I measure it in moments, the small, ordinary things that felt like they were building blocks of something eternal. Mornings when I would wake before the sun, slip quietly into the kitchen, and start the coffee just so he'd wake up to the smell. Even as a boy, he'd wander in, with his hair sticking up in every direction, rubbing his eyes, and sit at the counter while I scrambled eggs. He never knew it, but those mornings were my anchor. I was a single mother, not by choice, not because I wanted to be, but because life left me no other option. His father was gone before he even knew how to tie his shoes, and from that day forward, it was just the two of us against the world. Every bill, every scraped knee, every late-night fever, it was all mine to carry, and I carried it gladly. There were nights I went to bed with an empty stomach so he could have a full plate. There were winters when I patched his coat with my own hands, because a new one wasn't in the budget. But children don't remember the sacrifices in the way we think they will. They remember the magic. And I made sure he had it. On Christmas mornings, I would string up lights even if the bulbs were half burned out, and I'd bake cookies that filled the house with the smell of vanilla and cinnamon. We would decorate the tree together, and though the ornaments were mismatched and old, to us they looked like treasures. I taught him how to hang the angel at the top, balancing him on a chair when he was small, and later watching him stretch tall enough to do it without my help. Those moments were my reward, the glow in his eyes, the laughter echoing through a home that otherwise felt too quiet. School projects became our weekend adventures. I would spread out construction paper and glue across the kitchen table, cutting out shapes while he scribbled drawings of rockets and dinosaurs. When science fairs rolled around, we stayed up late, building volcanoes that spewed baking soda foam. He would run into class the next morning, proud, chest puffed out, telling his teacher, "My mom helped me." And I would stand at the back of the room, unseen, smiling, because that was enough for me. Every summer, when other kids went away on vacations, we made our own memories. Picnics at the park with peanut butter sandwiches and plastic cups of lemonade. Nights sitting on the porch, watching fireflies light up the yard while he asked me endless questions about life. Questions I didn't always have answers to. And yet, he trusted me to guide him. That trust, that closeness, was everything. I never remarried, never brought another man into the house, not because I didn't have the chance, but because I didn't want him to feel second place to anyone. I thought naively. Perhaps that if I gave him all of me, he would always know I was his safe place. Family was all I had, and he was my everything. As he grew older, the traditions deepened. I remember one Christmas Eve, when money was tight, I couldn't afford the toy he wanted most. I stayed up late, sewing a little stuffed bear from scraps of fabric, wrapping it in shiny paper, praying he wouldn't notice it wasn't store-bought. When he tore it open, he hugged it so tight and whispered, "Thanks, Mom. You're the best." I cried that night, quietly, because in his innocence, he saw love where others might have seen lack. I poured myself into his future. Every book fair, every parent-teacher conference, every football game in the freezing cold, I was there. I worked double shifts just to save for his college fund. When he graduated high school, I clapped so loud my hands ached, tears streaming down my face as he walked across that stage. That diploma felt like it belonged to both of us. And through it all, I thought we were unbreakable. I thought no matter where life took him, he would always remember the woman who had stood in the shadows, cheering him on, patching the holes, making sure the ground beneath him never gave way. But love doesn't come with guarantees. You can give your whole life to someone, piece by piece, and never know the day when they'll turn and walk away. At the time, though, I didn't see it. All I saw was my son, my pride, my reason for every sacrifice. Family was all I had, and he was my everything. I never imagined the day would come when I'd feel like a stranger in my own son's life. For years, it had been just the two of us, a team that couldn't be broken. But when he met her, when he brought his wife into the picture, something in the rhythm of our family began to change. At first, it was subtle, almost invisible, like the smallest crack in a glass you don't notice until the light catches it just right. She came with a smile that seemed warm enough, polite words rehearsed like lines from a script. I wanted to believe her kindness was genuine. I wanted to believe she saw me as more than just her husband's mother. But there were little moments, fleeting expressions, that told another story. At family dinners, when I'd try to share an old memory about his childhood, she would cut in with a laugh that wasn't laughter at all, it was dismissal. Her eyes would dart toward him, as if to say, "Why does she keep talking?" The first time I felt the shift was at Thanksgiving. I had cooked for days, every dish seasoned with the care only a mother brings. The table was full, the house smelled like rosemary and butter, but when I placed the stuffing down, his favorite since he was a boy, she looked at it and said lightly, "Oh, we don't really eat that kind of food anymore." Just like that, something sacred to me was brushed aside. My son chuckled, picked up his fork, and went along with her words. He didn't defend the tradition, didn't remind her of all the times he had asked for it. He just nodded, as though the memory we shared no longer mattered. One moment like that can be excused, but it wasn't one. It became a pattern. I would invite them over for Sunday dinner, the way we always used to, but the excuses began to stack up: work deadlines, social events, too tired, too busy. Weeks slipped into months, and suddenly my kitchen felt colder, quieter, as though the very heart of my home had been taken. Phone calls grew shorter. Where once he would call to ask my advice, to tell me about his day, now it was reduced to quick check-ins, rushed words that ended with, "I'll talk to you later, Mom." Later rarely came. There were arguments too, small but piercing. One afternoon, I reminded him of a family gathering he had promised to attend, and he snapped, not with anger that belonged to him, but with words I knew were whispered to him behind closed doors. "Why do you always guilt-trip me? We have our own lives now." My heart sank, because I had never used guilt, only love. Yet somehow, love had been recast as a burden. The more she settled into his world, the more I felt pushed to the edges of it. At Christmas, where once I hung the angel on the tree with him, she insisted on a new star, modern, shiny, untouched by history. He placed it where the angel used to sit, and I stood there quietly, pretending not to notice what had been replaced. At birthdays, I found myself seated farther down the table, her friends and family filling the seats closest to him. My voice felt smaller in those rooms, drowned out by laughter that didn't include me. When I spoke, she would glance at her phone or whisper something to him that pulled his attention away. And he let it happen. It wasn't outright cruelty, not at first. It was the quiet erosion of a bond, piece by piece, until the foundation that once held us so steady began to weaken. I started to wonder if I was imagining it, if perhaps I was too sensitive, clinging too tightly to a role that no longer belonged to me. But then came the first betrayal I couldn't ignore. It was my birthday. I waited all day for his call, watching the clock, reminding myself he was probably busy. By evening, I couldn't take the silence anymore. I dialed his number. He answered with laughter in the background, the sound of a party. When I asked if he remembered what day it was, there was a pause, then a flat, "Oh, happy birthday, Mom. We've been out with friends. I'll make it up to you." But he never did. After that, there were more missed calls, more broken promises. Times he said he would visit, then canceled at the last minute with excuses that felt rehearsed. I saw her fingerprints in every decision, every distance that grew between us. And yet, through it all, I kept asking myself one question that haunted me at night when the house was quiet and the shadows felt heavier than usual. Was I losing him, or had I already lost him? Christmas Eve has always been my day. The one night of the year I poured everything I had into creating warmth, even when life gave me very little. That morning, I woke before the sun, just like I used to when my boy was small. The house smelled of cinnamon and nutmeg as I rolled out the dough for his favorite pie, the same one he begged for every December. I stirred the filling slowly, thinking of the look on his face when he'd see it waiting on the table, believing perhaps foolishly that food still had the power to remind him of home, of me. On the counter sat neatly wrapped boxes, not lavish, but each chosen with care. For my son, a leather wallet I had saved for, engraved with his initials, because I wanted him to carry a piece of me wherever he went. For his children, bright sweaters, puzzles, and storybooks, things that would keep them warm and let them know that Grandma hadn't forgotten the magic of childhood. Every ribbon tied, every tag handwritten, carried pieces of my heart. I wrapped them slowly, smoothing the paper so there wouldn't be a crease, as though perfection in presentation could make up for everything that had gone wrong between us. I dressed carefully, not in anything fancy, but in the cardigan he once complimented, the one he said made me look festive. I wanted to look like the mother he remembered, the one who used to stand by the Christmas tree with hot cocoa in hand. My reflection in the mirror looked older, more tired than the woman in those memories. But I told myself it didn't matter. Family would see past the lines on my face. Or at least, they should have. The drive over was quiet, the streets dusted with snow, houses lit with twinkling lights. Every porch I passed seemed alive with joy, families gathering, voices spilling out of open doors. I told myself ours would be the same once I arrived. My heart beat faster as I pulled into their driveway, clutching the casserole dish that had been his favorite since childhood. I had balanced it carefully on the passenger seat all the way there, guarding it as though it were fragile glass. When I rang the bell, the door opened, and there she was. My daughter-in-law stood smiling, but it wasn't warmth. It was the kind of smile that never touched the eyes, polite, practiced, thin as glass. "Oh, you made it," she said, her voice bright but hollow. She leaned in for a hug, but it was one of those embraces where her arms barely touched me, her body stiff, as if contact with me were something to endure. Behind her, my son appeared, distracted, his phone in his hand. He gave me a quick glance, a half smile that vanished before it could settle. "Hey, Mom," he muttered, already turning back toward the noise of the living room. I stood in the doorway for a moment, longer than I should have, clutching the dish, feeling like a guest rather than family. The house was filled with voices, but not the kind that wrapped you in warmth. There was laughter, yes, but it wasn't laughter that reached me. It floated around me, bouncing off walls, as if I wasn't part of it at all. I placed the casserole on the table, arranging my gifts neatly under the tree, trying to ignore the looks exchanged when I did. Her friends were there, people I had never met, people seated close to my son, speaking to him as though they knew him better than I did. At the table, I tried to join the conversation, telling a small story about his childhood, how he once stayed up all night trying to catch Santa in the act. My voice was soft but clear, hoping to draw a smile from him. Instead, she cut me off, her laugh sharp as glass. "Oh, we don't really do those old stories anymore," she said, brushing me aside as if traditions had no place in this house. My son didn't defend me. He simply sipped his drink, eyes fixed on something across the room. I tried again later, asking the children if they liked the presents I had brought. They were polite, sweet, but I caught the way she looked at me like I was overstepping, like my love for them was unwelcome. Even the children seemed careful, glancing toward their mother before answering, their excitement muted, controlled. And then, the comments began. Small, sharp things disguised as jokes. "You always bring so much food. but we're trying to eat healthier now. Or, it's sweet, you still wrap everything with ribbon. Most people don't have time for that anymore. Each word chipped away at me, leaving me colder than the snow outside. And still, I smiled. Still, I told myself not to ruin the evening. But what struck me hardest was the way my son sat there, silent. He didn't notice the tension in my shoulders, didn't see how hard I was trying to fit into a place that once was mine. When I caught his eye, he looked away, as though meeting my gaze would cost him something. There were glances exchanged between them, subtle, but I noticed. The kind of looks people share when they have a plan no one else is supposed to know. Her hand brushed his arm, his lips curved into a smirk so faint I almost doubted I saw it. For a moment, I wondered if I was imagining things. But the unease in my chest told me otherwise. Something wasn't right. Something was being prepared, and I was the only one not in on it. I told myself to push through, to hold on to the pieces of the night that still felt like mine. But deep down, I could feel it, the air had changed. I was no longer the heart of this family. I was the outsider, tolerated, kept at arm's length. And as I sat there at the table, listening to laughter that didn't include me, watching my son slip further from my reach, I felt the question rise like a shadow pressing against my chest. What was waiting for me that night? Was I still part of this family, or had I already been replaced? The evening dragged on in a haze of polite smiles and clipped laughter. My heart was heavy, but I told myself to endure after all. It was Christmas Eve. When the chatter in the living room grew louder, I excused myself, saying I'd forgotten one last thing in my car. My son barely lifted his head, and she simply nodded, her lips tight in that same half-smile. The night air hit me like a wall as I stepped outside. Snow had begun to fall again, the flakes sharp, stinging my cheeks like tiny needles. I pulled my coat tighter and crunched across the driveway, the sound of my boots echoing against the silence. I leaned into the car, fumbling in the back seat for the last small gift I had, tucked away a framed photograph of my son as a boy, grinning with chocolate smeared on his face, one I thought he might laugh at. I had wrapped it gently, almost nervously, afraid he would think it childish, but to me, it was a reminder of who we used to be. I stood there for a moment, clutching the package, watching the glow of the house from the driveway. Through the window I could see silhouettes moving, laughter spilling faintly into the night, but I couldn't hear their words. It was like watching life unfold from the outside, like pressing my face against glass to glimpse a world I no longer belonged to. When I walked back, my breath clouding in the cold, I reached for the doorknob. It didn't turn. The door was locked. At first, I thought maybe I'd grabbed the wrong handle, so I tried again, twisting harder. Nothing. My chest tightened. I pressed my face closer to the glass, knocking lightly. The laughter inside didn't stop. No one moved toward the door. I knocked louder. Still nothing. My hand trembled as I pulled out my phone, the screen glowing against the black night. I texted my son. "I'm outside. The door is locked. Can you open it?" No response. I waited, the minutes dragging, the snow soaking into my shoes. My fingers stiffened around the gift, the ribbon dampening under melting flakes. I called his phone. It rang once, twice, then went to voicemail. I tried again, no answer. The sound of my own knocking grew desperate, echoing across the porch. I rang the bell, the chime faint inside, but still nothing. The cold began to seep through my coat, wrapping around my arms like iron chains. My breath came ragged, white clouds dissolving in the air. Tears blurred my eyes, stinging as they froze against my cheeks. I wiped them away quickly, ashamed, even though no one was there to see. Was it a mistake? Had they locked it without realizing I was gone? Or had this been the plan all along, to lure me out with my own excuse and then shut me out of the life I had once built with my own hands? The thought struck like a blade, sharp and merciless. I knocked again, softer this time, my knuckles raw and red from the cold. "Please," I whispered, though no one could hear me. I could see movement inside, shadows passing, shapes sitting near the tree. They knew I was out there. They had to know, yet no one came. My phone buzzed at last, and my heart leapt. It was a message from my son. I opened it with frozen fingers. Only 4 words. "We'll talk tomorrow, Mom." My stomach dropped. Tomorrow? On Christmas Eve? I stared at the message, the letters burning into me as if they were carved in ice. My legs wavered beneath me, the strength drained from my body. I wanted to scream, to pound on the door until it cracked, but I didn't. I stood there, silent, the snow piling around my boots, my tears lost in the storm. The house looked warm from the outside, golden light spilling from every window, laughter rising again. But it wasn't for me. It was never meant for me. My son's world was behind that locked door, and I was on the other side, frozen, unwanted, erased. I wrapped my arms tighter around myself, gripping the gift so hard, the paper tore beneath my hand. My breath came in shallow gasps, the weight of betrayal pressing down until I thought I might crumble right there on the porch. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow, when Christmas would already be gone. Tomorrow, when the table would already be cleared, when the laughter would already be spent, when the children would already be tucked in with memories that didn't include me. Tomorrow, when I was no longer needed." The snow fell harder, blanketing the driveway, muffling every sound. I stood there until my body shook, until I could no longer feel my hands. The door never opened. The message was never followed by another. And in that frozen silence, a truth settled deep inside me, heavy and sharp. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't forgetfulness. They had locked me out of the house, out of the night, out of their lives. And as I turned back toward my car, every step crunching like bones underfoot, I knew one thing. This story wasn't over. They had closed the door on me, but I would not stay outside forever. No, I would find my way back in, not with pleading, not with tears, but with something colder, sharper, something they would never see coming. I stood there on the porch, the snow climbing past my ankles now, as if the earth itself wanted to bury me where I stood. The cold had stopped feeling like cold. It was something heavier, something that seeped past my coat, past my skin, right into my bones. I tried to rub my hands together, but my fingers were too stiff to move. The gift I'd carried from the car was now crushed in my grip, the paper soaked, the ribbon frayed. I pressed my forehead against the doorframe and closed my eyes. The wood was warm from the heat inside, but it gave me no comfort. Behind that door, life went on. I could hear the faint hum of voices, laughter, the clinking of dishes. The sound rose and fell, each burst of joy another needle in my chest. My breath caught in my throat as I realized that not one of those voices was calling my name. I thought about my son as a child. Christmas mornings when I woke before dawn to put presents under the tree. How he'd run down the hallway in his pajamas, his face glowing with excitement. How we'd sat together, just the two of us, sipping hot cocoa and watching snow fall outside. I had never once let him feel forgotten. Not once. Every moment of his life had been filled with my presence, my effort, my sacrifices. And now, he had left me outside, like some stranger knocking on the door of a house she didn't belong to. The snowflakes fell thicker, heavier, until the world around me blurred into white. My boots were soaked through, my toes burned, then went numb. I tried to curl my fingers into fists, but they wouldn't obey. My lips trembled as I whispered his name, not a shout this time, just a plea, a mother's plea. Nothing. No footsteps, no hand on the knob, no warmth. I felt my knees buckle and caught myself against the railing. The metal burned with cold against my palm. My phone, when I pulled it out again, was slick with melting snow. I tried calling once more, straight to voicemail. I sent another message. "Please, open the door. Please." The screen stayed dark. I thought maybe I should leave. Maybe I should walk back to my car, drive somewhere warm. But I couldn't move. My body stayed there on the porch as if rooted to the spot. My heart wouldn't let me go. I was still waiting for him to come back for me, for a mistake to be corrected, for the door to swing open, and for him to say, "Mom, I'm so sorry." But as the minutes turned to hours, the truth began to sink in. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't forgetfulness. This was deliberate. They wanted me gone. My presence had become an inconvenience, an embarrassment. My love had become a weight they didn't want to carry anymore. I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to hold in the sob that threatened to break out. The night air was so cold it hurt to breathe. Every sound from inside the children's laughter, the clatter of forks and knives, even the muffled Christmas music cut into me like shards of glass. They were making memories without me. They were rewriting family traditions with me on the outside. I slid down until I was sitting on the porch, my back against the locked door, my legs pulled close to my chest. Snow gathered in my lap. My hands were red and raw, my breath shallow. My mind drifted, heavy with exhaustion, to the years I'd spent working 2 jobs just to keep us afloat. The nights I'd skipped meals so he could eat. The college tuition I'd paid off by selling my car. All of it so he could have the life he had now, the life behind that door. And this was my thank you. This was my reward. Locked out, erased, forgotten. A tremor ran through me. I realized I could barely feel my feet anymore. My fingers were numb blocks of ice. I tried to move, to stand, but the dizziness hit me so hard I had to grip the railing to stay upright. My breath came ragged, my chest tight. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled. Midnight. Christmas Day had begun, and I was still outside. I turned my head and stared at the glowing windows. A shadow passed by my son's shape, unmistakable even through the frost. He didn't look out. He didn't pause. He walked past as though I didn't exist. And in that moment, something inside me cracked. But it wasn't weakness. It wasn't despair. It was a cold, clear understanding. They didn't just want me gone tonight. They wanted me gone forever. Out of their home, out of their holidays, out of their lives. The realization burned hotter than any fireplace ever could. My tears froze on my cheeks, but behind my eyes, something steeled itself. This wasn't just heartbreak anymore. It was knowledge. It was truth. And truth, even when it comes like a knife, is a strange kind of power. I stayed there, shivering, my back against the door, my body breaking under the weight of the cold. But my mind was awake, wide awake, counting the hours, remembering every detail. The look on her face, the silence of his phone, the message that said, "Tomorrow," I whispered to myself, my voice trembling but steady enough to hear. This is the last time they lock me out. The snow kept falling, but inside me, something had shifted. I was still outside, but I wasn't just a mother waiting to be let back in anymore. I was someone else now, someone who would remember, someone who would act, someone who would not let this night be the end of my story. The first pale light of morning began to bleed across the snow, turning everything a dull gray. I had lost track of time, minutes, hours. It all blended into one endless, freezing stretch. My body was no longer shivering. It was too tired to do even that. My fingers had gone numb long ago, my toes like stones inside my boots. My phone battery had died sometime in the night, the screen now black and useless in my pocket. I leaned against the door, eyes closed, thinking how ironic it was that on the very holiday meant for family, for love, for forgiveness, I had been cast out. My breath came slow and shallow. My lips were cracked. Each inhale hurt. Each exhale was a prayer. Then, at last, I heard it a click. The lock turning. A sound I had been waiting for. A sound I had dreamed about through every frozen minute. I forced my eyes open, blinking hard to clear the blur. The door creaked, opening just a few inches, then wider. Warmth and light spilled out onto the porch like a promise. For a moment, my heart leapt. This was it. My son had realized what he had done. He would reach for me, pull me inside, wrap me in a blanket, whisper an apology. We would talk. We would heal. All of it the cold, the pain would dissolve in a single moment of recognition. That's what mothers do, isn't it? We forgive. I pushed myself upright, legs trembling, and stepped forward. The smell of coffee, cinnamon, and pine hit me. It was exactly the scent of Christmas morning I had imagined. I crossed the threshold finally, into warmth. But what I saw stopped me cold. There, at the dining table where I had sat for years, in the chair I had always called mine, was another woman. She was laughing, her hands wrapped around a mug of cocoa. Her hair was styled neatly, her sweater festive, and she wore a small gold cross around her neck. She was comfortable, familiar even, like she belonged. My grandchildren sat on either side of her, chattering as though they had known her forever. My son stood behind her chair, a hand resting on her shoulder, his eyes bright with ease, not guilt. I felt my knees buckle. I gripped the doorframe to steady myself. The scene before me was like stepping into a photograph where I'd been erased. They hadn't just excluded me. They had replaced me. My eyes darted from one face to the next. No one looked at me with surprise. No one looked at me at all. My son met my eyes for the briefest second, then looked away. The woman smiled up at him as though she had every right to be there, in my place, in my life. I took a small step inside, my boots dripping melted snow onto the polished hardwood floor. The warmth didn't reach me. It felt like a stage, a performance I had been locked out of. I whispered, my voice raw and cracked. "Who is she?" No one answered. My daughter-in-law busied herself with the coffee pot, pouring another cup for the stranger. My son cleared his throat, but the words didn't come. The children laughed, oblivious, passing a plate of pancakes to the woman as though she had always been their grandmother. It was like I had died, and they had already replaced me. My mind reeled. Was she a neighbor? A family friend? Someone they'd been seeing in secret? A woman they had chosen to fill the space I had left the moment they locked that door? Every possibility felt like a knife twisting deeper. I reached into my coat pocket, pulling out the ruined gift, the framed photo of my son as a child. The paper was torn, the glass cracked from my grip in the cold. I held it up for a moment, my hand trembling. Nobody noticed. I lowered my arm slowly, staring at the broken frame, at the boy in the picture who once clung to me, who once needed me. I remembered every moment I'd sacrificed for him. Every late night, every early morning, every dollar stretched until it broke. And this was how it ended. The woman looked up at me finally, her expression unreadable. She didn't smile, she didn't frown. She simply looked, as if sizing me up, deciding what I was now: a guest, an intruder, a relic. I wanted to scream, to ask why, to demand answers. But no sound came out. My throat was too tight, my heart was too heavy. All I could do was stand there, my boots dripping, my fingers trembling, watching a life I had built continue without me. In that moment, something inside me went still. Not broken, not crushed, still. Cold, like the snow outside, clear, like ice. I saw everything for what it was. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a misunderstanding. They had opened the door only when they were ready for me to see exactly what they had done. And I did see. Every detail, every smile, every touch, every small gesture meant to tell me without words that I no longer belonged. I stood there longer than I should have, my breath shallow, my hands empty. Then, slowly, I turned around. I didn't slam the door. I didn't cry. I simply walked back out into the snow, leaving wet footprints on the polished floor behind me. And as the door clicked shut again, sealing me out once more, I whispered to myself, "They think this is the end of me." But it wasn't. It was only the beginning. I didn't react the way people expect in movies. There was no dramatic confrontation, no wild shouting, no doors slammed for effect. I walked away. I drove home with my hands clenched around a steering wheel that felt too small, and when I closed my own front door behind me, I did not break down the way my chest wanted to. Instead, I sat very still in my kitchen, the kettle barely boiling on the stove, and I let the shock settle into a kind of cold clarity. Grief came first, deep and immediate, the fierce ache of loss for a life I had built, the sting of being replaced at the very table where I had once been the center. Then, beneath that grief, something else arrived, a measured resolve that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with dignity. You learn, after a long life of doing the right things for the wrong reasons, how to translate hurt into action without letting it eat you alive. I made a list, not a list of petty retaliations, but a ledger of practical steps I could take to safeguard myself and make my absence noticeable in ways they could not ignore. I began by taking stock of my affairs. Papers that had once been stuffed into drawers, insurance policies, bank statements, mortgage documents were pulled out and laid across the table. I read each line with the careful attention of someone who had been dismissed and now needed to prove their existence. There were accounts I had opened for my grandchildren long ago, small savings tucked away in their names. There was a life insurance policy with clauses that could be adjusted. There was a box of letters from my son, yellowed at the edges, each one a record of time and trust. I made an appointment with an attorney the next week. I sat in a bright office, my hands folded in my lap, and spoke plainly. I told him everything. How I had been excluded, how doors had been shut on me, how I had been replaced. He listened without surprise. Lawyers hear more cruel things than this every day. He explained the mechanics, how a will could be amended, how beneficiaries could be changed, how I could structure bequests so that what I left behind would not squander into the hands of someone who had treated me with contempt. He talked about trusts and charities and the small legal levers that can direct a legacy. I felt a measure of power in those words, practical and quiet, like the turning of a key. I rewrote my will. I did not do it in haste or spite. I did it with the same careful hands that had wrapped the gifts the night they shut me out. I set aside funds for the things that mattered to me, my church, a neighborhood center that helped single mothers like I had once been, scholarships for kids who had ambition but not the means. I adjusted the accounts I had opened for the grandchildren so that they would be managed by a trusted family friend rather than by the son who had chosen someone else over his mother. I left nothing to chance. There are other kinds of power besides financial. There is the power of truth, slow and steady, that can open eyes when evidence is presented without theatrics. Over the next weeks, I began to gather the details I had noticed for months but had dismissed as petty discomforts. Bank statements that suggested someone else had been withdrawing funds, the odd charges at restaurants that didn't fit the story they told when neighbors asked about their family holiday, messages on my son's phone, accidental notifications I happened to see when he left it on a counter during a visit months before that hinted at conversations I had never been a part of. I wrote everything down in a notebook, date by date, with the calm hand of someone recording history rather than venting fury. I could have made a public scene. I could have marched back to the house, waving the notebook, demanding answers as people watched. But spectacle rarely achieves what quiet certainty does. Instead, I began to let my absence be a presence. I stopped volunteering at the school events I had always attended. I did not bring casseroles for gatherings I had once cooked for. When family birthdays came, I sent cards and modest gifts that arrived on the day but were not accompanied by my shadow. People noticed. Conversations in the neighborhood shifted. A cousin called to ask if everything was all right. A former neighbor stopped by because she'd heard rumors and wanted the truth. I answered with measured honesty enough to explain my distance without turning it into a soap opera. There were choices I made that required a steadier hand. I contacted my grandchildren's pediatrician to confirm a simple medical proxy I'd had for years. I updated emergency contacts, not to control their lives, but so there would be no confusion if something happened to me. Small, responsible things that would force the family to acknowledge my role in practical terms, to remember that I still existed in forms that mattered. When my name was no longer listed on forms where it should have been, I made gentle inquiries. Each correction that was made carefully and quietly shifted the narrative back a degree. And then there were the letters. I wrote to my son more than once. Not angry rants, letters are brittle and can be torn away, but clear, composed messages that placed facts in front of him and asked for explanation. One letter detailed expenses I had covered over the years, offers he had accepted, and the ways his life had been tied to my choices. Another laid out the simple, unadorned truth of what Christmas Eve had done to me. How I had stood in the snow, how the door had remained closed, how the replacement had been seated without apology. I mailed them certified, so there would be a record. I expected anything, a phone call, a plea, silence. Mostly I received silence, but the paper trail mattered more than I had thought. I also reached out to people who mattered in his life, but who were outside the private circle, old friends, a neighbor who had known him since he was a teenager, even a former coworker who had once admired my resilience. I asked questions in the tone of someone trying to understand, not to accuse. Those conversations uncovered small things I hadn't fully known. Loans that had quietly been taken against a shared property, a pattern of handing over keys that made me uneasy, social media posts deleted quickly but archived in screenshots by a concerned friend. Nothing dramatic, nothing illegal, just enough of the truth to show that not everything was as it had been presented. The daughter-in-law's role in all this became clearer in private conversations. People are social creatures. They talk. The woman I had seen at my table was not the kindly neighbor I had hoped for. Financial strains, whispers of impropriety, hints of strategies to isolate me from decision-making, all of it began to form a picture. I could have published these whispers as accusations, but I preferred a different route. Evidence handled with care, presented to the right ears, can change circumstances without spectacle. So when the time came, I placed a measured letter in certain hands, copies of bank records, notes from trusted witnesses, a clear, fact-based account of the night that had changed everything. I did not smear anyone's name with rumor. I offered documentation and asked for oversight. That is how reputations shift, not by shouting, but by responsible disclosure that asks institutions to do their jobs. Meanwhile, I withdrew the small supports I had been providing. I had been helping with childcare now and then, driving children to after-school activities, fixing meals when both parents were stretched thin. I stopped. I did not announce it as punishment. I simply rearranged my life. When they called asking for help, I deflected with reasons rooted in practicality, appointments, obligations, the need to focus on my own health. The absence was a quiet echo. It made them adjust plans and notice the missing plate at the table. People adapt quickly when convenience is gone. It was not revenge so much as recalibration, allowing them to feel the practical consequences of excluding me. There were moments of temptation when my hands itched for a dramatic reveal, a scalding confrontation that would explode on camera and satisfy the hunger of an audience I had never wanted. I resisted because I had learned the value of restraint. Extra noise obscures the facts. Patience clarifies them. I watched them, from a distance, as they rearranged their calendar and their comforts. I watched how the woman in my chair performed ease, how my son smiled in ways he had not smiled with me for a long time. I kept my dignity by refusing to perform for their drama. And then, slowly, other things began to happen that I had not contrived. People began to ask questions in ways I had not expected. A neighbor remarked at church that they had seen suspicious charges on a local fundraising page. A cousin mentioned overhearing a conversation about financial stress that didn't involve their parents. A small, responsible inquiry from a community leader uncovered an inconsistency that led to a more formal look into household finances. None of this was theatrical. None of it was instantaneous. It was a sequence of small reckonings, each one built on facts, each one widening the circle of awareness until the story could no longer be contained behind closed doors. Through all of it, I kept my composure. I spoke to people with measured candor. I let the facts stand on their own. I did not gloat when the truth began to surface. There is no pleasure in another's downfall, even when it is deserved. What I felt instead was relief. Relief that honesty was no longer something only I held. Relief that the history we shared could be acknowledged in a way that respected the sacrifices I had made. The most important part of my plan, if one can call it that, was this. I refused to let bitterness define my days. I started to build a life outside the orbit of a house that had rejected me. I reconnected with old friends, signed up for a class at the community college I had once supported, and volunteered at the center I'd once earmarked in my will. People who had been on the periphery stepped forward in ways I had not anticipated. New routines formed. New rituals took root in the places I chose to spend my time. My absence grew loud enough to be noticed, my presence elsewhere steady enough to replace the part of my identity that had been tied to their approval. The combination of legal steps, careful documentation, and intentional withdrawal created consequences that were not vindictive but inevitable. Doors that had once opened for me now required explanation from my son and his wife. Invitations dwindled. An inheritance that might have poured into hands that had shown little respect was redirected to causes that made a difference. Conversations that had ignored my voice began to consider it. I never sought to publicly humiliate them. What I wanted was accountability, and that arrives in many forms. I wanted the family to understand the cost of what they'd done, to see the vacuum they'd created, and to reckon with the choices that got them there. I wanted my grandchildren to grow up surrounded by people who honored truth and steadiness rather than convenience and charm. Most of all, I wanted to reclaim a portion of my life that had been quietly usurped. In the quiet months that followed, I watched the house from a distance sometimes, not out of obsession, but out of curiosity, the way one might watch a once familiar play from a different seat and notice details missed before. There were awkward conversations, a few attempts at rapprochement, apologies that tasted like rehearsed lines. I read those carefully and knew what to accept and what to keep at arm's length. I forgave where it felt right, and I kept boundaries where it did not. Forgiveness and boundaries are not opposites. They are companions in rebuilding. When news spread in small circles, structured, factual, not sensational, there were consequences. Neighbors offered sympathy. A family friend, the kind who sees patterns without being cruel, quietly suggested mediation. The son faced questions from his employer about unexplained absences. The woman who had taken my place at the table found herself navigating scrutiny she had not expected. None of it was instant retribution. None of it was theatrical. It was consequence, an adult word for the accumulation of small truths exposed to the light. And through it all, I learned something essential. Strength does not always roar. Sometimes it is the act of standing up a little straighter, the decision to change legal documents, the quiet withdrawal of daily assistance, the steady accumulation of proof, in short, the patient refusal to play a role you were not invited to inhabit. Revenge, in the way I enacted it, was not about breaking them. It was about reclaiming my life and ensuring whatever I left behind would support values I believed in. There were nights I still felt the cold in my bones, memories of that porch that would not be knocked loose. But those nights were fewer, and they no longer defined me. I found warmth in other kitchens, in the laughter of friends who had not known me when I had been defined by my role at a single table. My life continued. My story did not end frozen on a doorstep. It continued in careful steps, in practical choices, and in the quiet satisfaction of knowing I had not let a single cruel night determine the rest of my days. The days after that Christmas Eve felt like living in the hollow shadow of a funeral, except the person being buried was me, and the mourners didn't even know they should grieve. I didn't return calls, I didn't send messages, and when the next holiday rolled around, my chair remained empty. The very absence they had mocked me with became my weapon. At first, no one seemed to notice. They carried on, posting photos online of smiling faces around their tree. My son and his wife holding the kids in matching pajamas, captions dripping with phrases about family and togetherness. But behind every picture-perfect frame, I saw the truth. The gap where I used to stand, the hole in traditions they could never quite fill. Relatives began asking questions quietly at first. My sister called, confused as to why I hadn't shown up at her New Year's brunch. Old friends from church reached out, wondering why I hadn't sent my usual batch of homemade cookies. Then whispers began to circle in the community. People wanted to know why a woman who had dedicated her life to raising her only son suddenly vanished from his world. I never offered explanations. I let silence speak for me. And in that silence, suspicion grew. My daughter-in-law's polished smile began to crack under the weight of curious glances, questions she couldn't answer without twisting the truth. My son started to feel the strain. At work, colleagues asked about me, remembering the times I'd brought lunch to his office or bragged about his promotions. He stumbled through excuses, and slowly, those excuses began to sound hollow, even to his own ears. At family events where I once carried the warmth, their gatherings turned colder. No one laughed quite the same way without me orchestrating the traditions. The stockings looked empty even when they were full. The children grew restless, sensing the tension no one wanted to name. And then, the real consequences began to bite. My son, once shielded by my support, found himself struggling financially. The safety net I had woven for him over decades, help with bills, quiet loans that were never repaid. The inheritance he assumed was waiting, all of it was gone. He had chosen to lock me out, and with that single act, he had locked himself out of every gift I could have given him in the years ahead. Word of what had happened started to seep out. I didn't speak a word, but people saw enough. A neighbor who'd glimpsed me standing in the snow that night mentioned it to another. Soon, the story spread like frost across a window pane. A mother, left outside in the cold by her own son. Some didn't believe it at first. How could a man treat his mother that way? But the more the tale circulated, the more his reputation began to crumble. At church, people looked at him differently. The warmth of respect he once commanded cooled. At school meetings for the children, other parents glanced at him with quiet judgment. It was subtle at first, but shame has a way of compounding, snowballing into something you can't outrun. He tried to reach out eventually, but every call rang unanswered. Every letter found its way back unopened. For the first time, he was forced to live without the safety of my approval, my forgiveness, my unconditional presence. They thought locking me out that night would silence me. But sometimes, silence is the loudest revenge. Sometimes the absence of love, the absence of a mother's unwavering devotion, leaves a wound no apology can heal. And the truth was, I didn't have to humiliate him myself. The world did it for me. Every whisper in the community, every curious glance at a family gathering, every moment of financial struggle, they were echoes of the choice he made when he turned that lock against me. By trying to erase me, he erased himself. And in that empty chair, he thought he'd filled with someone else. A shadow lingered my shadow, reminding them all that you cannot replace the person who gave you life, no matter how hard you try. In the months that followed, something happened I hadn't expected. The woman who had taken my chair that night, the smiling replacement, the one they thought could erase me, revealed her true colors. At first, she was a constant presence in their lives. She charmed them with compliments, showered the children with small gifts, and slipped into their photos like she had always belonged. But time has a way of peeling back the mask people wear. Soon, her generosity came with conditions. Every favor had a price. Every kindness demanded something in return. She whispered promises of helping my son build new business connections, of supporting them in ways I never could, but the truth was, she was there for herself. It began with money. Little requests at first: help with a bill, a short-term loan, something she swore she would repay. Then, it grew bolder. Investments, vacations, luxury items she insisted were necessary. My son, eager to prove his loyalty to the family he chose, complied. He poured his savings into her hands, believing she was the key to a brighter future. Until one day, she was gone. No explanations, no apologies, just empty bank accounts, unpaid debts, and secrets left hanging in the air. Neighbors whispered that she had moved to another town, living with someone else, boasting about the money she had taken. And in that silence, my son finally began to understand. He had locked out the one person who had loved him without condition, who had sacrificed everything for him, who had never asked for anything in return. He had traded a mother's devotion for the empty promise of someone who vanished the moment her pockets were full. Regret is a heavy weight, heavier than the snow that pressed on my shoulders that Christmas Eve. He carried it quietly, but I saw it in the small ways: his attempts to reach out, his stumbling words when he tried to explain, the loneliness that seeped into his voice. But some bridges, once burned, cannot be rebuilt. And as I sat in my quiet home, surrounded by memories and photographs of the years I had given him, I realized something. My story was not one of loss, it was one of discovery. I had thought my identity was bound to my role as his mother, but when he locked that door, he freed me to see myself differently. I discovered that strength is not measured by who stays beside you, but by how you rise when they turn their backs. I discovered that sometimes blood does not define family, respect does. Loyalty does. Love that doesn't ask you to shrink yourself or erase your worth does. If you made it this far into my story, give this video a like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And please, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I want to know how far this story traveled. Every message, every like, every share reminds me that I wasn't left outside in the cold alone. That Christmas Eve, I lost my son, but I found myself, and that was the greatest gift of all.